Hello, friends. My name is Cindy, and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today, for Black History Month, we're going to start reading Who Was Frederick Douglass? From the Who Was series by April Jones Prince. And it says on the back, a boy born into slavery who taught himself to read and write, a young man who escaped to freedom in the North, and the father of the civil rights movement. Are you ready? Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born a slave. Just like a horse or a plow, he was the property of a white man. From a young age, Frederick wondered why that was so. Wasn't he as smart, strong, and deserving of liberty as everyone else? At the time Frederick was born, in 1818, there were 1.5 million black slaves in the southern United States. Most didn't learn to read. This was against the law, but Frederick taught himself to read and write. Most slaves didn't risk their lives to run away to freedom. This was against the law too, but Frederick escaped and helped others do the same. Most escaped slaves did not speak out against slavery. It was very dangerous to do so. But Frederick spoke up anyway. With words as his weapons, Frederick spent his life fighting for equal rights for all people. He was the father of the civil rights movement. Chapter 1, A Young Slave. The man who became famous as Frederick Douglass was born in a log hut on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1818. His name at birth was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Frederick's mother, Harriet, was a slave, which meant Frederick was a slave too. They were owned by a man named Aaron Anthony. The slaves called him Captain Anthony, or Old Master. Here's the house that he was born in. Who was Frederick's father? It may have been Captain Anthony. Frederick never knew for sure. Captain Anthony owned 3 farms and about 30 slaves. He also managed the farms of a very rich man named Edward Lloyd. The Lloyd family owned 13 farms and more than 500 slaves. Captain Anthony lived on the Lloyd's main farm, Y House Plantation. Some of Captain Anthony's slaves lived there with him. Others, including members of Frederick's family, were spread out across other farms. Frederick's mother worked long hours in Captain Anthony's fields or in those of a neighbor who rented her. Frederick saw his mother only 4 or 5 times in his life. Instead, he lived with his grandparents, Isaac and Betsy Bailey. Isaac was a free man, but Betsy was a slave. Her job was to care for her many young grandchildren until they were old enough to work. Frederick's early years were happy ones. For a time, he knew little of slavery. He enjoyed fishing in a nearby stream and watching squirrels scamper about. His grandparents' windowless cabin, with its clay floor and dirt and straw chimney, was small and rough, but to Frederick, it held the attractions of a palace. Then one day, Betsy brought him to work at Captain Anthony's. Betsy kept the reason for their journey a secret so as not to upset young Frederick. It was a 12-mile walk, so his strong grandmother had to tote him on her shoulders now and then. In the heat of the afternoon, they finally arrived at the grandest building Frederick had ever seen. Y House was white, with stately pillars and a neatly trimmed lawn. The plantation sat on the Y River and was like its own little village, with barns, stables, kitchens, blacksmiths, and shoemakers' shops, and more. Captain Anthony lived in a separate house on the property. Slavery in America. Slavery had been part of American history since early colonial days. The first blacks were kidnapped from their homelands in West Africa and brought to Virginia by ship in 1619. The slave trade continued for almost 200 years until it was outlawed in 1808. No new slaves could be brought into the country after this time, but existing slaves had children. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the southern states, where large wheat, cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice plantations depended on slave labor. In the North, where farms were smaller, slavery was not as common or as profitable. For this and other reasons, slavery in the North had died out. Rowdy slave children surrounded Frederick when he arrived at Y House. Frederick's grandmother introduced him to his brother and two sisters whom he'd never met. Betsy encouraged Frederick to play with the children. And finally, he reluctantly joined them. Sometime later, one of them ran up and hollered, "Fed, Fed, Grandmammy gone!" Frederick raced to the kitchen to see for himself. Betsy was indeed gone. For good. Almost heartbroken at the discovery, Frederick later wrote, "I fell upon the ground and wept a boy's bitter tears." It was the first time he experienced the cruelty of slavery. One morning, soon after, Frederick was sleeping in a rough kitchen closet. Suddenly, he woke to the terrible shrieks of his Aunt Hester. Old Master was whipping Hester for spending time with her boyfriend. Frederick watched through cracks in the closet door. He never forgot the horrific scene. From that day on, Frederick hated slavery with all his heart and soul. Because Frederick was still too young to work in the fields, he ran errands, looked after the cows and chickens, and kept the front yard clean. It wasn't hard work, not anything like hoeing, planting, weeding, and harvesting crops from sunup to sundown. He wasn't often whipped or beaten, but he was cold and hungry. In hottest summer and coldest winter, Frederick remembered, I was almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse tow linen shirt reaching only to my knees. Frederick slept on the dirt floor of the kitchen closet without a bed or a blanket. On the coldest nights, he would climb inside a corn sack to try and keep warm. The hunger was even worse. Aunt Katie was a cold-hearted slave who looked after the slave children. She served cornmeal mush in a long trough placed on the ground. The strongest children got the most food, but even that wasn't much. Sometimes Frederick's belly was so empty he fought the dogs for crumbs that fell from the table when Aunt Katie prepared food for Captain Anthony's family. One day, Aunt Katie made Frederick go the whole day without food. That night, he quietly plucked a few grains from an ear of Indian corn. He was roasting the grains by the fire when his mother appeared on one of her few visits. Harriet was furious when she learned that her son had not eaten. She gave Aunt Katie a fiery lecture and replaced Fredericks Corn with a heart-shaped ginger cake. In the care of his mother, Frederick felt like a king, but when morning came, his mother was gone. He never saw her again. Harriet died shortly thereafter, though no one bothered to tell Frederick until some time later. Thankfully, better days were ahead. Chapter 2, Baltimore. At Y House, Frederick ran errands for Miss Lucretia, Captain Anthony's daughter. Sometimes, when Frederick was especially hungry, he would stand beneath Miss Lucretia's window and sing. Miss Lucretia often rewarded him with a piece of bread. This small act of kindness was like a sunbeam in the young slave's life. Frederick had been at Y House about 2 years when Miss Lucretia and her husband, Thomas Auld, sent Frederick off to Baltimore. This is Captain Thomas Auld. Frederick would live with Thomas's brother Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. It would be Frederick's job to run errands and look after the couple's 2-year-old son Tommy. Frederick was thrilled. He was only 8, but he was bright and curious. He had often wondered about life in the big city. Before leaving, Frederick spent the better part of 3 days in the creek scrubbing. Miss Lucretia gave him his first pair of trousers. This is a map of where Baltimore is. On Saturday morning, Frederick boarded a boat at the Y House wharf, hoping never to see the plantation again. For a boy who had always lived in the country, the city of Baltimore was overwhelming. With more than 60,000 residents, Baltimore was one of the largest cities in the United States. Here's a picture of it. Tall brick buildings shut out the sky. Delivery wagons crowded the busy streets as they headed to and from the harbor. The sun beat down on the hard brick pavements, almost blistering Frederick's bare feet. A ship hand brought Frederick to his new home. The Auld family met Frederick at the door. Frederick loved little Tommy at once, and he was surprised by the kind look on Sophia Auld's face. Mrs. Auld had never owned a slave, and she treated Frederick more like a son. For the first time in his life, Frederick slept in a bed with covers. He had good bread to eat and clean clothes to wear. He also discovered there were such things as books. He asked his mistress to teach him to read, and she did. In no time, Frederick had learned the alphabet and could spell short words. Proud of his progress, Sophia told her husband about it. Hugh Auld's response was swift and sure. He forbade his wife to teach Frederick any more. Not only was it against the law, he said, but an education would make a slave want to escape. Mr. Auld was right. Frederick understood that knowledge was power. From that moment, Frederick said, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. From then on, whenever Frederick ran an errand, he carried a book and pieces of bread. He would do his errand quickly and find a hungry white boy in the streets and trade bread for a lesson. When Frederick was 12, he bought his first book with 50 cents he had earned shining shoes on the street. The Columbian Orator was filled with speeches by famous people. One was a discussion between a master and a slave, in which the slave stated the many reasons why slavery was wrong. The slave's points were so strong, the master unexpectedly set him free. Frederick read this speech over and over. For him, freedom seemed to be forever out of reach. At the Auld's house, Frederick began to hear the word abolition. He didn't know what this word meant. Master Hugh and his friends would bring it up when they were discussing slavery. A dictionary told Frederick that abolition meant the end of acting something. Then, in a newspaper, he found an article about the abolition of slavery. There were people, abolitionists, who wanted slavery to end. There were groups of abolitionists in northern states trying to help slaves escape to freedom. This was astounding news. Frederick began to think about how to run away to the north. He was around 13, too young to plan an escape, but the thought gave him hope. Also, before he escaped, there was something important Frederick wanted to do: learn to write. With this ability, he might be able to write a fake permission slip from his master, allowing him to travel north safely. Frederick practiced writing using chalk on fences and pavement. Later, Frederick copied letters in Tommy's old spelling book. Sometimes he worked late into the night after the family had gone to bed. It took years of hard work, but finally he learned to write. Chapter 3, Becoming a Man. While Frederick was in Baltimore, Maryland, Captain Anthony died. This meant Frederick was now the property of Miss Lucretia and her husband Thomas. It wasn't long before Lucretia died too. When Frederick was 15, Hugh and Thomas Auld had an argument. Thomas demanded that Frederick be sent to him where he was now living, in the run-down port of St. Michael's, near Frederick's birthplace. This was bad news for Frederick. Thomas Auld was a stingy master. Frederick and the other slaves had to beg and steal for food, while bread and meat sat spoiling in Master Thomas's storehouses. Frederick sometimes let his master's horse run off just so he could go after it. The horse liked the neighbor's pasture, and Frederick liked the bread that he got from the cook there. Master Thomas knew what Frederick was doing and decided that city life had ruined his slave. He was spoiled. To make Frederick more obedient, Master Thomas hired him out to a brutal slave breaker named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey rented a farm 7 miles away on Chesapeake Bay. Mr. Covey made Frederick and the other slaves work in the fields in all weather, sometimes until midnight. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field, Frederick remembered. One blazing August day, Frederick and a few others were separating wheat from straw. Suddenly, Frederick, dizzy and shaking, collapsed from the heat and hard work. Covey kicked him and told him to get up. When Frederick couldn't, Covey hit him over the head with a slat of wood. Blood ran freely from Frederick's head as Covey continued to kick him and shout. Finally, Covey left Frederick lying in the dirt. Not long after, Frederick was tending the horses when he felt a rope slip around his ankles. Covey meant to take him down, but something in Frederick snapped. He had been working like an animal long enough. Frederick grabbed Covey's throat and didn't let go. It was rare and dangerous for a slave to attack a white man. After nearly 2 hours of fighting, Covey gave up. He never laid a hand on Frederick again. The fight with Covey was a turning point in Frederick's life as a slave. I was nothing before. I was a man now, Frederick later wrote. His desire to be free grew stronger than ever. And tomorrow we will read more in Who Was Frederick Douglass by April Jones Prince. I hope you enjoyed this book. It's very exciting, and I will look forward to reading to you again. My name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians in Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thanks for stopping by, friends.